Alright, Sebastian. I'm gonna give you one last chance, but I don't want to hear any of that fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant, you hear me? Good. Now I'm just gonna go stand over here. Is that fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant? Is that fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant? No fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant. Fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant. Hey! No fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant. No fancy jazz in my fucking fancy restaurant. Fancy restaurant, no fancy jazz. No fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant. I like this, it's got a kind of a swing to it. Hey, wait a minute, that's fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant. Fancy jazz. Is that fancy jazz? In my fancy restaurant. I hear fancy jazz in my fancy restaurant. You bitch. No fancy jazz. I said no fancy jazz. Ow! My fancy restaurant, you dick. Play what I told you to play. Yes. Christmas music in August.